The hum of the projector was the only sound I could focus on. It was a low, steady buzz, a constant note, underneath the nervous rhythm of my own heartbeat. I had spent the last 3 months living and breathing this presentation, late nights, skipped lunches weekends, spent hunched over spreadsheets, and designed mock-ups. This project was my chance to show them I was more than just the quiet one in the corner. I clicked to the next slide, my hand a little unsteady, as you can see from the Q3 projections. If we pivot the marketing spend to focus on this emerging demographic, we can potentially see a 15% increase in engagement. I tried to make eye contact around the table. My manager, Sarah, gave a small noncommittal nod. But it was the table beside her that held my attention. Mark from accounting and Chloe from sales. They were the office royalty, confident, loud, always at the center of every joke. The word hit me like a physical blow. Professional. It was the armor they used to hide their own mediocrity, the shield they used to bludgeon anyone who dared to step out of line. I tried to speak, to defend my work, to defend myself. But the words wouldn't come. The pressure behind my eyes was building, a dam about to break. I looked down at my notes, the carefully prepared bullet points, blurring into indecipherable lines. I called the team meeting for 4 o'clock. The air in the conference room was already thick with dread. I could see it on their faces. They knew they'd seen the numbers. I stood at the head of the table, the spreadsheet projected on the screen behind me like an indictment. I didn't even sit down, I just started talking. And my voice came out all wrong. It was sharp, brittle. I wasn't leading, I was just transmitting pressure. I zeroed in on Sarah. Her report had been a day late, just one day. But it was the easiest target. My words were like little razors. I criticized her methodology, her formatting, her summary. I called it sloppy. I said it lacked initiative. I saw her flinch just a little, but she didn't look down. She just took it, her face a mask of professional calm. That calm made me angrier. It felt like a challenge. Then Mark spoke up. He's our senior analyst, been here the longest. His voice was quiet, but it cut through my tirade. He said, with all due respect, Sarah's report was the most comprehensive one we had. She stayed late all week to get it done, even with the data delays from accounting. And then it happened. The whole room seemed to shift. A murmur of agreement, a nod from Ben, a supportive glance from Chloe. They weren't just defending her, they were forming a wall against me. And that's when I broke the pressure from upstairs, the rebellion in front of me, the sheer exhaustion of trying to hold it all together. It just overflowed. My face got hot, my vision blurred. And the tears started. They weren't dignified, silent tears. They were messy. My voice cracked. And I tried to speak, to reassert control. But all that came out was a choked sound. I was crying right there, in front of everyone. And they laughed. It wasn't a loud, cruel laugh. It was worse. It was a low, collective exhale of disbelief. A few snorted chuckles, a shake of the head. Mark just looked away, a smirk playing on his lips. That sound, that quiet, dismissive laughter, was the most humiliating thing I have ever experienced. It wasn't just that they didn't respect me, they saw me as a joke. My authority didn't crumble, it dissolved into nothing right then. And there I turned and walked out, not even bothering to dismiss the meeting. The sound of that laughter followed me all the way down the hall. I went back to my office and shut the door. I sat there in the dark, the glow from the computer screen, the only light. The silence was absolute. And in that silence I had to face it. I had to replay every moment, every time I'd taken credit for their work, every time I'd dismissed a concern. Because I was too stressed to listen. Every arbitrary deadline I'd set to make myself look good to the directors. I had created a culture of fear. I had mistaken their compliance for respect. And today they showed me the difference. The laughter wasn't cruel, it was justified. It was the only honest response to the performance I'd been putting on for months. I was the failed leader, the punchline of my own miserable joke. I thought about resigning. It would have been the easy way out, a clean break. But running away felt like the final, cowardly act. The real challenge wasn't to leave, it was to face what I had broken. I took a shaky breath, but it caught in my throat. A tear escaped, tracing a hot path down my cheek. I quickly wiped it away. But it was too late. From the corner of my eye, I saw Mark nudge Chloe. I heard the unmistakable sound of a suppressed snicker. The room was silent, except for that hateful whispering laughter. And then, clear as day, Chloe's voice, meant to be a whisper, but pitched perfectly to carry. Oh, for heaven's sake, so unprofessional. I looked at my office door. It was just a slab of white painted wood. But it was a symbol. It had been a barrier, my hiding place, the place where I made decisions in isolation, and then presented them as commands. It had to become something else. I stayed late that night long after everyone had gone home. I opened a blank document, and I started to write. I didn't write a corporate memo. I wrote an apology, a real one. I addressed it to the entire team. I named my failures. I wrote about the unfair criticism of Sarah. I admitted that my leadership had been driven by fear, not vision. I acknowledged the laughter. I said they were right to have no respect for me, because I had done nothing to earn it. I apologized for the toxic environment. And then I made a promise, not a vague promise, a specific one. I promised to listen. I promised to shield them from the unreasonable demands from upstairs. Instead of just passing the pressure down, I promised that our next meeting would be a conversation, and that I would be there to learn, not to lecture. I printed it out. I found a piece of tape, and I put it on the outside of my office door for everyone to see first thing in the morning. It was the most vulnerable I have ever felt. I was hanging my shame out for public display. The next morning I got in early. I sat at my desk, my heart pounding. I heard the first person arrive. It was Chloe. I heard her stop, a long silence, then her footsteps quick and light moving away. Then Ben, another pause, a low whistle. The office slowly filled up. But it was quiet, a different kind of quiet, not the quiet of fear, but of stunned disbelief. I gave them an hour, then I sent a calendar invite for a standing meeting. No agenda, the subject line just said a new start. Walking into that break room was harder than any board presentation. They were all there, standing around, not talking. The air was thick with skepticism. I didn't stand in front of them. I pulled up a chair and sat at the table with them. My hands were trembling, so I put them flat on the table. I started by thanking them for coming. I told them that the apology on the door wasn't just words. I said that their laughter, as painful as it was the wake-up call I desperately needed. I admitted that I had no right to demand their trust, but that I was asking for a chance to earn it. And then I did the scariest thing. I shut up. I said, I am here to listen. Tell me what this team needs to succeed. Tell me what I need to stop doing. Tell me what I need to start doing. The silence was heavy. Then Mark spoke. He was blunt. He listed 3 projects where my micromanaging had caused delays. Sarah talked about the lack of clear communication from upper management. Ben mentioned how morale had plummeted. I just listened. I took notes. I didn't get defensive. I didn't explain myself. I just said, thank you for telling me what would a better way look like. We spent that hour curating a new set of team norms. We agreed on realistic deadlines. We decided on a weekly roundtable where everyone could speak freely. We defined my new role not as a commander, but as a buffer and a facilitator. I gave them the power. The anger in the room didn't vanish, but it slowly gave way to something else, a cautious, fragile curiosity. That was it, the dam burst. I mumbled something, an apology, an excuse about the room being stuffy. I don't even know what I said. I gathered my laptop, my notes, my trembling hands, fumbling with the cord. I didn't look at anyone. I just turned and walked out, the sound of my own choking breaths loud in my ears, the echo of their judgment ringing in the silence I left behind. The weeks that followed were awkward. I had to bite my tongue 100 times a day when a stressful email came from upstairs. I didn't panic and demand immediate action. I called the team together, showed them the email, and we discussed a realistic collective response. I started praising their ideas in meetings. I defended them when other departments made unreasonable requests. I was trying to build a shield for them, not a whip. A month later, I took the apology down from my door. It had served its purpose. In its place, I put up a large, simple sign that said, "Our wins." The first thing I posted was the successful completion of Sarah's project, with a note about her innovative solution that saved the client. The next week, it was a graph showing our team's improved efficiency. Crediting the new collaborative workflow that Mark had designed. The door was no longer my barrier. It was our wall, a testament to what we were building together. We never talk about the day I cried. The laughter is a ghost in the room, a memory we all share. But its meaning has changed for me. It's a permanent reminder of the leader I never want to be again. For the team, I think it's proof that people can change, that authority isn't about a title on a business card. It's a fragile thing granted by the people you lead. It's earned through respect, empathy, and the courage to be vulnerable. They followed me because they had to. Now they contribute because they want to, and that is the only metric that really matters. The noise in the restaurant was a constant low hum, silverware clinking against plates, the murmur of a dozen other lunch conversations, the occasional burst of laughter from a nearby table. It was our usual Friday spot. And the team was all there. Sarah was telling a story about her weekend. Mark was laughing, and I was just present. My phone was face down on the table, a little black rectangle, next to my water glass. Then it buzzed, a single sharp vibration. I flipped it over casually, expecting a spam email or maybe a weather alert. But it was a text from my sister. The preview line showed just the first few words: "I am so sorry it happened so fast, there was nothing anyone could." My heart didn't just sink, it plummeted. My sister doesn't send messages like that. She's the strong one, the one who uses full sentences and proper punctuation. This was fragmented, rushed, panicked. My mind instantly went to my dad. He's been having some health scares lately, or my mom. I felt the blood drain from my face. The restaurant noise faded into a dull roar, like I was suddenly at the bottom of a well. I tapped the screen to open the full message. My hands were already unsteady. The text loaded. "I am so sorry it happened so fast, there was nothing anyone could do. We're all just devastated. He was such a good boy." The words didn't compute at first. He, my dad. Then it clicked. The photo shed attached loaded a second later. It was a picture of my dog Baxter, from just last week, his tongue lolling out, his eyes bright. The message continued. "The vet said it was probably a stroke. He didn't suffer. I didn't want to tell you over the phone while you were at work." Baxter, my dog, the dog Id, had since college, the one constant through bad jobs, bad breakups, moving apartments. He was 14. I knew it was coming someday. But you're never ready, you're never prepared for that finality. A sob caught in my throat. It was a physical reaction, a wave of grief so sudden and so complete that I had no defenses against it. My eyes welled up, instantly hot and stinging. The walk back to my office was a blur. The fluorescent lights of the hallway seemed unbearably bright. The cheerful good morning from a passing colleague felt like an assault. I shut my office door and leaned against it. The cool wood against my back, the silence in here, was absolute, a stark contrast to the roaring humiliation in my head. I slid down to the floor, pulling my knees to my chest, and let the sobs come, great heaving waves of shame and anger. They had taken my work, my passion, my moment, and they had twisted it. I looked up from my phone, trying to blink the tears away. But it was useless, they just spilled over. I saw my coworkers looking at me. Sarah had stopped her story. Mark's smile had faded. There was a beat of silence at our table. And then Mark let out a soft, nervous chuckle. "Whoa. Hey, it was just a joke," he said, looking around at the others. "We were just talking about the surprise. We didn't mean to, well, spoil it." I stared at him. "A joke, a surprise? My dog was dead, my family was devastated. And he was laughing. It wasn't a mean laugh, it was awkward, confused." But in that moment, through the blur of my tears, it felt like the cruelest sound I'd ever heard. Sarah joined in with a strained smile. "Yeah, don't be so dramatic, it's nothing bad, I promise." Their laughter felt like a physical blow, dramatic. Nothing bad. I felt a coldness wash over me, separate from the heat of my grief. They thought I was crying over some office prank, some stupid surprise. The disconnect was so vast, so profound, that I couldn't even form words. I just shook my head, pushed my chair back, and mumbled something about needing air. I didn't look at them. I just walked away from the table, leaving my half-eaten sandwich behind, feeling their confused eyes on my back all the way to the door. The walk back to the office was a blur. The sun was too bright, the traffic too loud. All I could think about was Baxter, his goofy bark, the way he'd wag his whole body when I came home, the weight of him sleeping on my feet at night. And layered over that grief was a new sharp pain, the feeling of utter isolation. My team, the people I saw every day, had laughed at me in my worst moment. They dismissed my pain as some sort of overreaction. The betrayal was a bitter taste in my mouth. I got back to the office, building the sterile, quiet lobby, a stark contrast to the noisy restaurant. I rode the elevator up alone, staring at my distorted reflection in the metal doors. I couldn't face them. I couldn't sit at my desk and pretend everything was okay. The idea of explaining it to them, of having to say the words out loud, "My dog died," felt impossible. It would make it too real, and I was barely holding it together as it was. But I also couldn't let them think whatever it was they thought, that I was unstable, that I cried at the mention of a surprise. I needed them to know. I needed there to be a reason for my tears that wasn't trivial. I didn't want their pity, but I couldn't stand their misunderstanding. Then I had an idea, a simple, clear way to communicate without having to say a word. I went to the supply closet and found a large piece of white cardstock. I took a black marker from my desk drawer. My hand was still shaking. I took a deep breath and began to write. I made the letters big and bold, so there would be no mistaking it. My family dog Baxter passed away unexpectedly today. He was with me for 14 years. I may be a little out of sorts, thank you for your understanding. I read it over, it was direct, it was the truth. I found a roll of tape, walked to my office door, and carefully fixed the sign right at eye level. It was like hanging a piece of my grief out for everyone to see. It felt vulnerable. But it also felt necessary. I grabbed my bag, sent a quick email to my manager saying I wasn't feeling well, and was leaving for the day. And I walked out. I didn't see anyone, the floor was quiet. I just left the sign there, a silent explanation hanging on my door, and I went. Into a joke, they had reduced me to a crying mess, in front of the entire team. Home to grieve in peace. The team came back from lunch about 20 minutes after Id left. They were still a little confused, a little uneasy. The plan for the surprise retirement party for old Mr. Henderson in accounting was supposed to be the big topic of the afternoon. They'd been so careful to keep it a secret from everyone, especially me, since I am notoriously bad at keeping a straight face. They thought my tears at the restaurant were some bizarre over-the-top reaction to their cryptic hints. They figured I'd put two and two together and gotten upset about being left out of the loop or something. Sarah was the first one to round the corner and see my office. She stopped dead, her cheerful "Okay team, let's finalize those decorations" died on her lips. Mark, walking right behind her, bumped into her. "What's going on?" he asked, and then he followed her gaze. There it was, the white sign, the black letters. The message was unmistakable. The air went out of the hallway, the playful energy from their lunch, the excitement about the surprise party. It all evaporated in an instant. Sarah's hand flew to her mouth. "Oh my God." She whispered. The words were like a punch to the gut. Mark just stared, his face pale. He thought we were laughing at him, laughing at that. The horror of the misunderstanding dawned on him. And it was a physical thing. He actually took a step back, as if pushed by the weight of it. We actually laughed while he was getting that news. The rest of the team gathered around, their chatter dying down as they read the sign. A wave of collective guilt washed over them. The secret they'd been guarding, the surprise party for a colleague who was leaving after 40 years, suddenly felt incredibly stupid, insignificant. Their awkward, nervous laughter at the restaurant now seemed, in the clear, harsh light of this truth, like the most heartless cruelty. "We have to fix this," Sarah said, her voice firm, cutting through the stunned silence. Right now, there was no discussion. The party planning was forgotten. Emails about cake and streamers were ignored for the next hour. The office was a flurry of a very different kind of activity. It wasn't about celebration anymore, it was about atonement. I was at home, sitting on my couch with a blanket wrapped around me, just staring at the wall. My phone had been buzzing intermittently, but it ignored it. Then there was a firm but gentle knock on my apartment door. I wasn't expecting anyone. I thought about not answering, but the knocking persisted. I shuffled to the door and looked through the peephole. For a long time, I just sat there on the floor, hollowed out. The shame was a heavy blanket smothering me. But then, as the storm of emotion began to recede, something else started to kindle in the emptiness, a low, steady burn. Anger, not the hot, tearful anger of the conference room, but a cold, sharp, and clear anger. This wasn't just about a bad presentation. This was a pattern. It was the stolen ideas they passed off as their own, the subtle put-downs in group emails, the way they ruled the office through a mixture of. The entire team was standing in the hallway, all of them, Sarah, Mark, Jessica, Ben. They looked terrible, worried, apologetic. Even before they said a word, I took a deep breath and opened the door. Sarah spoke first, her eyes were redrimmed. "We are so sorry. We saw your door. We had no idea what we did, what we said at lunch. It was awful." Mark stepped forward. "We were being idiots. We were so wrapped up in this stupid secret, this surprise party for Henderson, in accounting, that we completely misread the situation. We thought you'd figured out our plan, and were upset about it." Our laughter it was pure social clumsiness, panic, because we thought we'd spoiled the surprise. It was never ever about you. We feel sick about it. He handed me a large paper bag. Inside was a container of soup from the place we'd just left, a new book from the store down the street, and a gift card to a local coffee shop. We wanted to do something," he said helplessly. Jessica spoke up softly. We all chipped in. Ben even went and got a frame. She held out a small, simple frame. Inside was a printout of the photo of Baxter that my sister had sent me. They'd asked her for it. They'd found her number and called her to explain the situation, and to ask for a picture. They'd told her they wanted to make things right. I was speechless. The anger I'd felt, the sense of betrayal, it just melted away. It was replaced by a heavy but warm understanding. They hadn't been cruel, they'd been clueless, they'd been trapped in their own little world of office secrets. And they'd completely missed the signs of a real profound pain. "It's okay," I finally said, my voice thick. "You didn't know." "That's no excuse," Sarah said firmly. "We should have asked, we should have checked in. Instead, we made an assumption. And it caused you more pain. We're your team, we should have acted like it." We stood there for a while in the hallway, talking. They told me more about the Henderson party plan, and the absurdity of the misunderstanding became even clearer. I told them a little about Baxter. It was hard, but it felt good to say his name to people who finally understood the weight of it. The following Monday, the atmosphere in the office was different. The usual professional barrier was gone. There was a new ease between us, a sense of genuine care that hadn't been there before. The incident, as painful as it was, had stripped away a layer of pretense. We'd seen each other at our most vulnerable and our most remorseful, and we'd come out the other side. Charm and intimidation. I was just the latest target. The surprise party for Mr. Henderson happened a week later. It was a nice event, but it felt like just a party. The real event, the one that changed the fabric of our team, had already happened. It happened in a moment of miscommunication. And it was resolved not with a grand gesture, but with a simple, honest sign on a door, and the courage to say, "We were wrong." We learned that you can share a table with people every day and still not see them, and that sometimes the most important communication happens when you're not even in the room. The conference room felt sterile. The air conditioning hummed a low, constant note, a backdrop to the nervous energy buzzing in my own chest. I'd spent weeks on this campaign. It wasn't just another project. It was the one. The concept felt pure, honest. It was about connection in a digital age, using warm, hand-drawn illustrations to talk about community. I believed in it with every fiber of my being. I clicked the final slide. The screen glowed with the key visual, a simple, beautiful sketch of two hands, almost touching, surrounded by a cascade of intricate organic patterns. I looked around the table at my colleague. Sarah from marketing was checking her phone under the table mark. The senior copywriter had that familiar smirk playing on his lips. But I pushed through. I explained the vision, the research, the emotional core. I finished, my voice a little too hopeful. "So that's the human thread. I really think this could resonate." The silence that followed was heavier than any criticism. Then Mark cleared his throat. "Resonate with who exactly?" "A knitting circle from 1985. A few chuckles rippled through the room. Sarah looked up from her phone. "It's very sweet, but it lacks edge. It feels naive. Our demographic wants sleek. They want smart. This looks like something you'd find on an inspirational poster in a kindergarten." The words kept coming. Irrelevant, quaint, doesn't scale. They weren't critiquing the work anymore. They were dismantling the feeling behind it. They were mocking the part of me that believed something gentle could also be powerful. Each comment was like a small incision, precise and dismissive. I tried to defend it, my voice tightening. "The data supports the approach to authenticity," I stammered. But they smelled blood. Mark leaned back, folding his arms. "Look, we get it. You put your heart into this. It's just not professional." And that's when it happened. The pressure behind my eyes became too much. A hot tear escaped and traced a path down my cheek. I swiped at it quickly, but it was too late. They saw it. A different kind of silence fell, then a low chuckle from Mark. "Oh, come on, really? You can't be that sensitive about a mood board." The laughter that followed wasn't loud, but it was corrosive. It was the sound of being completely misunderstood, of having your deepest conviction treated like a childish whim. I didn't say another word. I just gathered my laptop, my printed decks, feeling like lead weights in my arms. And I walked out. The sound of their laughter followed me down the hall, a sharp, echoing humiliation. I didn't go home. I went straight to my office and closed the door, leaning against it, as if to block out the entire world. The hurt was a physical ache. It wasn't just about the project. It was about the violation. They had looked at something I loved and called it worthless. For an hour, I just sat there in the dark, the glow of my computer screen, the only light, feeling utterly defeated. I couldn't fight them on their terms. I wasn't loud. I wasn't charismatic. A direct confrontation would just lead to more laughter, more accusations of being unprofessional or overly emotional. No. If they fought with mockery and whispers, my response had to be different. It had to be undeniable. It had to be so calm, so factual, so impeccably professional, that their laughter would suddenly look exactly like what it was: childish, cruel, and ultimately a liability. But then a shift, the raw stinging pain began to simmer into something else. Anger, a clear focused anger. Arguing with them was pointless. They spoke a language of cynicism and dismissal. I didn't have the words to fight that, but I had something else. I had my hands, I had my craft. I looked at my office door, a blank white impersonal surface, the same as every other door in this sterile building. And I knew I wasn't going to write an email, I wasn't going to complain to HR, I was going to answer them in the only language that made sense to me. I was going to use the very thing they mocked. I went to the supply closet and took everything. I took reams of thick, high-quality paper, rolls of tracing paper, sheets of black poster board. I gathered every marker, every pen, every scalpel and ruler from my desk. I brought in my personal tablet and set up my portable lightbox. This wasn't going to be a note. This was going to be a monument. The first step was the structure. I measured the door with a meticulous eye. I needed a grid, a foundation. I drew it lightly in pencil, creating sections, planning the flow. This wasn't random. It was a composition. I started with the criticism itself. I took their words, naive, irrelevant, lacks edge. I wrote them out in a cold, sterile corporate font. I printed them and cut them out, placing them at the top of the door like a headline from a bad newspaper. Then I began to answer beneath the word naive. I started drawing, but not just any drawing. I created an incredibly detailed, technically precise infographic. It was about the science of nostalgia, the neurological response to organic shapes versus sharp geometric ones. I used data from our own market research charts. I built from scratch, showing engagement rates with warm aesthetics. I rendered it all by hand with a technical pen. The lines so sharp and clean, they looked printed. It was the opposite of naive. It was intellectually rigorous, defensible, cold, hard fact, disguised as art. Under irrelevant, I designed another section. This one was a timeline, a beautiful flowing illustration that connected art movements from the past to modern design trends. It showed how the human desire for connection, for the handmade, was a constant thread. I drew influences from Art Nouveau, from folk art, showing how these irrelevant styles were constantly being rediscovered and revered. It was a history lesson on my door, proving that what they called irrelevant was in fact timeless. The centerpiece directly in the middle of the door was for lax edge. This is where I poured everything. I recreated the key illustration from my presentation, the two hands almost touching. But this time I drew it with a furious, powerful line. I used stark black ink on a pure white background. But then I built a frame around it out of the very things they considered edge, shattered glass shapes, sharp, angular patterns, fragments of digital code. And I made the gentle illustration crack through that frame. I showed the soft lines breaking the hard edges, proving that true power isn't about being sharp, it's about being resilient, it's about something genuine breaking through a facade. I worked through the night, my back ached, my fingers were stained with ink. But with every line I drew, every piece I carefully glued into place, the weight lifted, the frustration and the shame were being metabolized into pure focus. This was no longer about them. This was about me, proving something to myself, that my vision had weight, that my craft had teeth. By the time the sun began to rise, casting a soft blue light through the window, it was done. My office door was no longer a door, it was a statement. I stood up, wiping my face. My hands were steady now. I walked to my desk and opened my laptop. The screen glowed in the dim office. I opened a blank document. The revenge wouldn't be a shout, it would be a statement, a quiet public correction. I thought about what they had done. They had mocked me for showing emotion. They had used the guise of professionalism to cover for their bullying. And then I remembered the email from HR that everyone had skimmed and deleted just last week, the new company-wide initiative on gallery quality piece of polemic art, a silent, intricate, and devastatingly intelligent rebut. I left before anyone arrived. I couldn't bear to see the initial reaction. I went home, showered, and changed my body, humming with a strange mix of exhaustion and triumph. When I walked back into the office a few hours later, a strange hush had fallen over the floor. People weren't at their desks. They were clustered in small groups near my door. No one was talking loudly, they were just looking. I walked towards the crowd. They parted from me without a word. And there it was, standing in the morning light. The transformation was absolute. The white door was now a tapestry of ideas, a symphony of black and white, and careful gray tones. It was dense, beautiful, and intimidatingly smart. I saw Sarah standing there, her arms crossed. She wasn't smirking. She was studying the infographic under naive, her brow furrowed. She traced a line of the chart with her eyes. I saw her realize that the data she had dismissed was actually compelling, presented here, with an authority that was impossible to ignore. Mark was staring at the center illustration. He was quiet, his usual arrogant posture was gone. He looked smaller. He was seeing the concept he called childish rendered with a technical mastery. Conceptual clarity that he, a wordsmith, could never achieve. He was confronted by the sheer quality of the work, and it left no room for his mockery. The laughter from the day before felt like a distant, embarrassing memory. The head of the design department, a woman I deeply respected, was there with a client. She was not saying anything, she was just pointing at different sections of the door, a slow smile spreading across her face. The client was nodding, impressed. I heard her say, "Now this is how you present an idea, this is conviction." I didn't say a word, I didn't need to. The work was speaking for me, and it was speaking volumes. It said, "I understand the principles better than you." It said, "My emotional investment is backed by intellectual firepower." It said, "You called this week, but look at the strength it took to create this." By lunchtime, people from other floors were coming to see it. Someone took a picture, and it spread through the company's internal chat. The messages weren't about the crying, they were about the door. "Have you seen the door on 4? It's incredible. Who did that? The concept is brilliant." The respect that was offered to me that day was different. It wasn't pity. It wasn't the careful kindness you extend to someone who broke down. It was a genuine, earned respect. I was no longer the sensitive artist who cried in a meeting. I was the designer who created that, the one with the formidable talent and the quiet, unshakable nerve. Mark avoided me for a week. When he finally had to speak to me about a project, his tone was completely different. There was a new caution, a deference. He had been intellectually and creatively outmaneuvered on a battlefield he didn't even know existed. His criticism had been rendered hollow not by my arguments, but by my demonstration of skill. Mental health and psychological safety in the workplace. The memo that explicitly mentioned fostering an environment where employees feel safe to express ideas without fear of ridicule. That door stayed up for a month. Management never asked me to take it down. I think they understood it had become more than a protest. It was a piece of company culture, a reminder of what we were capable of when we channeled our passion into our craft. And the lesson settled deep within me, a quiet, permanent truth in a world full of loud, dismissive voices. The most powerful rebuttal isn't a shout. It's the silent, meticulous work of mastering your craft so completely that your creation becomes your most eloquent voice. You don't have to win the argument, you just have to build the cathedral. It was just a normal Tuesday. The quarterly reports were due, the phones were ringing off the hook, and the air in the open plan office had that specific tense hum of a place trying to do too much with too little time. Id felt it building all morning, a tightness in my chest that had nothing to do with the deadlines. It was a familiar feeling, the slow creep of my anxiety, something I've managed for years. Usually, I can feel it coming and retreat to my office, close the door, do my breathing exercises. I have a system. It's private, but it works. But that day, the wave came too fast. I was at the printer waiting for a stack of documents, and it just hit me. It wasn't about the reports, it was everything. The fluorescent lights suddenly felt like they were buzzing inside my skull. The sound of keyboards clicking became like little hammers against my ears. My vision started to tunnel, the edges going dark and fuzzy. I couldn't get a full breath. It was like an elephant had decided to sit on my ribcage. I reached out to steady myself against the printer, my hand trembling so badly, I missed the warm metal and just grasped at the air. I must have made a sound, a small choked gasp, because Sarah from marketing turned around. "You okay, David?" she asked, but her voice sounded like it was coming from the end of a long hall. I tried to nod to say I was fine, but the words wouldn't come. My throat was closing up. I could feel the cold sweat breaking out on my forehead. This was it, the full-blown panic attack I always worked so hard to avoid in public, and I was right in the middle of the busiest part of the office. Then I heard it, a nervous chuckle. It was Mark from sales. "Whoa, David, looks like those reports are really getting to you," he said, his voice too loud, too jovial. Someone else, I don't even know who, joined in with a weak laugh. It wasn't mean laughter. Not exactly. It was the kind of sound people make when they don't know what else to do, when they're uncomfortable. It was the sound of pure, unadulterated awkwardness. "Maybe he just needs some fresh air," another voice offered, but the tone was dismissive. "Toughen up, Buttercup," someone else muttered, just loud enough for me to hear. They were leaning back in their chairs, arms Crossed, Mark was doodling on his notepad, Chloe was staring at her phone, a faint, bored smile on her face. A small, cold smile touched my lips. That was it. That was the key. I began to type. I didn't write an accusation, I didn't name names, I simply crafted a message. I chose the font carefully, something clean and authoritative. I made the text large enough to be read from a few feet away. I worked on it for an hour, refining the wording, making it perfect. Then I printed it on the highest quality paper the office printer could manage. I found a simple black frame in the supply closet. I placed the paper inside. In that moment, surrounded by people I'd shared coffee with, joked with about weekend plans, I have never felt more alone. Their laughter, their discomfort, it built a wall around me. I was a spectacle, a problem. A piece of office drama. I managed to stumble away, my face burning with a heat that had nothing to do with the room's temperature, and practically fell through the door of my own office, shutting the world out. I sat there in the silence, my head between my knees, forcing air into my lungs. The physical symptoms slowly subsided. But the shame lingered. It sat heavy in my stomach. The urge to just go home to hide was overwhelming. I was angry. I wanted to send a furious email to the whole department. I wanted to name the ignorance, the cruelty of their reaction. But as my breathing slowed, a different thought started to form. They weren't cruel people. They were just uneducated. They saw a man falling apart over a spreadsheet, and their brains, short-circuited. They didn't see a medical episode. They saw a lack of resilience. And that's when I decided I wasn't going to hide in shame. I wasn't going to accuse them. Either accusation just builds taller walls. I was going to try something else. I was going to educate. I spent the rest of that day, and most of the evening after I got home, not fuming, but researching. I went to the websites of reputable health organizations. I found clear clinical non-judgmental descriptions of panic attacks. I printed out a page that listed the symptoms point by point: rapid heartbeat, shortness of breath, dizziness, trembling, a feeling of impending doom. I read those words and felt a weird sense of validation. It wasn't in my head, it was a documented physiological response. The next morning I got to the office early. I took a clean, simple sheet of paper, and I created a new sign for my office door. At the top it said, in a calm professional font, "What you might have witnessed yesterday, understanding panic attacks." Underneath, I bullet pointed the symptoms. I added a sentence. Panic attacks are a common symptom of anxiety disorders, affecting millions. They are not a sign of weakness. Then I added a second section. If you or someone you know struggles with mental health, you are not alone. I listed the number for our employee assistance program. I put the website for the National Alliance on Mental Illness. And finally, at the very bottom, I wrote a simple personal message. This office is a safe space to talk. Questions are welcome. I taped it to my door right at eye level. My heart was pounding again. But this time, it was with vulnerability, not panic. I was making my private struggle public. I was turning my office door into a bulletin board for my own fragility. It felt terrifying, but it also felt right. I went inside and closed the door, waiting for the office to fill up. I tried to focus on my work, but every footstep outside my door made me jump. I heard a pair of footsteps stop. There was a long silence, then they walked away. A little later, another person stopped. I heard a soft, thoughtful hum. The morning dragged on. I avoided going out for coffee, too nervous to face anyone. It was around 11 when I got the first email. It was from Sarah, the one who had first asked if I was okay. The subject line was just "Thank you." The email was short. She said she had no idea. She said her sister had panic attacks, and she'd never really understood what that meant. She apologized for her reaction. I felt a lump form in my throat. Frame the glass cool and smooth against my fingertips. It looked official, it looked permanent. Later Ben from accounting knocked softly and came in. He looked embarrassed. "I saw your door," he said, shuffling his feet. "I am really sorry about yesterday, David. We didn't get it." I told him it was okay, that I appreciated him saying something. He stood there for a moment. Then said, "My wife, she has depression. It's hard to talk about at work. People don't get it." And just like that, a connection was made, a thread of shared understanding. Throughout the day it happened again, and again. Not everyone came to talk, but I saw them reading. I'd glance through the window in my door and see small groups gathered there, not laughing, but reading quietly, pointing to a line, having a low, serious conversation. The nervous laughter from the day before was replaced by a kind of quiet contemplation. You could feel the shift in the atmosphere. The air felt less tense, more thoughtful. The real turning point came from an unexpected direction. Our department head Linda stopped by my desk in the afternoon. I braced myself for some kind of reprimand about professionalism. But instead she said, "David, that was a very courageous thing you did. And incredibly constructive." She told me that HR had been wanting to roll out more robust mental health support for years, but never found the right momentum. "You've started a conversation we desperately needed to have," she said. "Would you be willing to help?" That was the beginning of something I never could have imagined. What started as a sign on my door became a committee. We organized a company-wide mental health first aid training session. We brought in a speaker to talk about stress management. We created a dedicated confidential Slack channel where people could share resources and support. My office, the place I had retreated to in shame, became known as a place you could go to if you were having a bad day, no questions asked. I didn't set out to be an advocate. I just wanted to stop feeling so alone. I wanted the people around me to understand that what they saw wasn't a choice, it was a health condition. And by choosing to educate instead of accuse, by offering facts instead of fury, I didn't just make them understand me, I gave them permission to be more human themselves. The laughter that day was born from ignorance, the silence that followed, and then the conversations that was born from a little bit of knowledge and a lot more compassion. The culture didn't just change around me, I helped to change it by turning a moment of profound vulnerability into an opportunity for grace. I knew at the moment I saw the discrepancy. It wasn't a small thing, a rounding error. It was a deliberate, systematic reallocation of funds, millions of dollars, siphoned from the community outreach budget and funneled into, well, I didn't know where exactly, not at first, but the numbers didn't lie. I remember sitting at my desk, the glow of the spreadsheet, the only light in the room, my stomach turning to ice. It was late, everyone else had gone home, and I was alone with this terrible humming secret. I tried to do it the right way. I scheduled a meeting with my direct supervisor, Carol. I laid it out carefully, logically. I showed her the projections, the approved budgets, the actual expenditures. She listened, she nodded. And then she closed my laptop with a soft click. "You're very thorough," she said, her voice calm, patronizing. "But you're looking at this from a purely operational standpoint. There are strategic considerations. You aren't privy to. These reallocations are approved at the highest level. It's best to just focus on your own deliverables." The next morning I was the first one in the office. The floor was silent and dark. I carried the framed sign to my office door. I used the measuring tape from my desk drawer to ensure it was perfectly level. I pressed the adhesive strips firmly against the wood. I stepped back there. It was not a vengeful scrawl, not an emotional outburst. It was a monument to calm resolution. I pushed back. I said it wasn't strategic, it was fraudulent. The community grants we'd promised, the after-school programs, they were counting on that money. Her smile tightened. "Let's not use inflammatory language. This is a complex organization. You need to trust the process." But the process was the problem. I went over her head. I went to compliance. The head of compliance, a man named David, listened to me for about 5 minutes before holding up a hand. He said, "My concerns were noted," he said. "Should be proud of my diligence." Then he asked if I was happy here, if I saw a long-term future with the company. It wasn't a question. It was a threat wrapped in corporate politeness. The weight of it started to press down on me every morning. When I walked in, the secret felt like a physical thing. A cold stone lodged in my chest. I'd see my coworkers joking by the coffee machine, completely unaware that the foundation of the place was rot. And I'd have to force a smile. I was carrying this immense invisible burden. And I was the only one who seemed to care. The breaking point was the quarterly review. The entire department was in the conference room. Carol was presenting our team's metrics, all green arrows and growth percentages. She mentioned the streamlining of the outreach program, calling it a bold, cost-saving initiative. I felt my face get hot. I couldn't stay silent. My voice shook a little when I interrupted with respect. "Carol, that's not an accurate description. Those funds were misappropriated. The program wasn't streamlined. It was defunded to cover a shortfall elsewhere." The room went quiet. All the heads swiveled from me to Carol. Her expression was pure ice. "This is not the forum for unsubstantiated allegations," she said, her voice sharp. "We've discussed this. Your personal obsession with this issue is becoming a distraction." That word, obsession, it made me sound unstable. I could feel the eyes on me, some curious, some annoyed. I tried to explain, to tell them about the documents, the paper trail. But the words started to jumble together. The fear and the frustration, weeks and months of it, just welled up. My vision blurred. I tried to fight it back, to swallow the lump in my throat. but a tear escaped and traced a hot line down my cheek. Then another. I was crying right there, in front of everyone. There was a moment of stunned silence. And then it came a low chuckle from the back of the room. Then another. It wasn't loud mocking laughter, it was worse. It was a dismissive, condescending snicker. Someone whispered, "Jesus, get a grip." They saw tears. And they saw weakness. They saw an emotional overreaction to a settled matter. They didn't see the truth. They saw a crack in my professional facade. And they pounced on it in that moment, surrounded by their smug, compliant faces. I understood they weren't going to listen. The system was designed to protect itself. And I was just a malfunctioning part, to be quieted or removed. The laughter was the turning point. It was like a key turning in a lock. The fear didn't go away. It was still there, a cold knot in my stomach. But it was suddenly joined by a clear, sharp certainty. They had drawn a line. They had shown me that playing by their rules was a game I couldn't win. If I wanted the truth to be known, I had to stop whispering in soundproof rooms and start speaking where everyone could hear. I had to accept that my career here was over. The only question was how it would end, with me slinking away in silence, or with me making sure the truth came out with me. The sign read. I worked through the night. I didn't sleep. I went back to my cubicle. After that horrible meeting, my face still flushed, and I started compiling everything. This wasn't going to be an anonymous tip to a hotline that would get buried. This was going to be a public statement. My office door, a standard, unremarkable slab of painted metal, became my canvas. I printed everything. I created a timeline from the first suspicious transaction to the meeting I'd just endured. I printed copies of the key emails, the budget approvals, the internal memos discussing the liquidity event. That was the cover story. I redacted nothing except the names of low-level employees who were innocent. I wanted the focus to be on the decision-makers, on Carol, on David, on the VPs whose signatures were on the documents. At the top of the display, I put a single bolded title, a statement of conscience. Beneath it, I wrote a short letter. I didn't use legalese or corporate jargon. I wrote plainly. I said that I had discovered evidence of significant financial misconduct that harmed the communities we were pledged to serve. I said I had tried repeatedly to report this through official channels and was met with obstruction and threats. I said that the laughter in the conference room confirmed that the culture of this company would not allow the truth to be heard in private, so I was compelled to share it publicly. I stated that I accepted full responsibility for my actions and that my only goal was accountability. I signed my name at the bottom. It was the most terrifying thing I have ever done. My hands were shaking so badly, I could barely tape the first page to the door. But I kept going. By the time the sun started to come up, my door was covered, a mosaic of deceit laid bare for anyone to see. The first hour was quiet. A few early arrivals walked past, did a double-take, and stopped to read. I sat at my desk, just on the other side of the door, listening to the occasional gasp, the muttered, "Oh my God." I didn't look out. I just stared at my screen, my heart hammering against my ribs. Then the floodgates opened. The whispers started, the hushed, urgent conversations. I heard my name. I heard Carol's name. I heard David's name. The volume outside my door grew from a murmur to a steady hum. People weren't just walking by anymore. They were gathering. They were crowding the hallway, pointing, reading the documents out loud to each other. The laughter from the day before was gone, replaced by a palpable wave of shock and anger. I finally stepped out. The crowd parted for me. The looks on their faces weren't pity or ridicule anymore. They were a mixture of awe and fear. They saw the evidence, the sheer volume of it, and they understood this wasn't a hysterical complaint. It was a meticulously constructed indictment. I saw Sarah from accounting, her face pale, as she read an email she'd been copied on one shed. Never questioned. I saw Mark from marketing, who had laughed yesterday, now staring at the timeline with a grim expression. The foundation of the company, the illusion of stability and ethics, was shattering right there in the hallway. The news spread through the building like a shockwave. People came from other floors just to see it. My door became a pilgrimage site. Management's response was swift and panicked. First, a security guard arrived and told people to disperse. Nobody moved. Then Carol appeared, her face a mask of controlled fury. She saw the display, saw her name everywhere. And for a second, her composure broke. I saw real fear in her eyes. She started to tear the papers down. But someone in the crowd shouted, "We've already seen it. We have copies." It was true. People were taking pictures with their phones. The information was already out of its cage. By lunchtime, the CEO and the board were involved. The building was put on lockdown. We were told to return to our desks an emergency all-hands meeting, was announced. The official word was that an unsubstantiated incident was being investigated. But everyone knew the earthquake had already happened. I was escorted to the HR department by two very nervous-looking senior managers. They weren't treating me like a crying, unstable employee. Anymore, they were treating me like a bomb that had already gone off. This office is a designated zone of psychological safety, in accordance with the Hartman Group's Initiative on Workplace Wellbeing HR Policy 47. Here, all colleagues are respected, and constructive feedback is always welcome. Unprofessional conduct, including personal ridicule and harassment, undermines our team and will be reported. In the end, there was an investigation, a real one led by an external firm. Carol and David were placed on administrative leave and were eventually fired. The board had to publicly acknowledge the fraud and commit to repaying the misappropriated funds. Policies were changed, heads rolled. I was offered a settlement, a generous one, with a strict confidentiality clause. I took it. I knew I could never work there again. To some, I was a hero. I got emails from junior employees thanking me for having the courage they didn't. To others, I was a traitor, a pariah who had burned the place down. On my way out, the company's reputation was tarnished, and some people lost their jobs because of the fallout. I carry that weight. I never wanted anyone to get hurt. I just wanted the truth to be known. I found a new job in a different industry. No one knows my story. There sometimes I miss the old place, the friends I thought I had. But the satisfaction I have is quiet. It's the knowledge that, when I was faced with a choice between my comfort and my conscience, I chose the harder path. I chose to speak even when my voice shook. The cost was high. My career path was irrevocably altered. But I can look at myself in the mirror. I can sleep at night. And I learned a lesson that's etched into me now. Sometimes doing the right thing doesn't mean filing a report. Sometimes it means taping that report to your door for the whole world to see, and being willing to accept the consequences. The laughter was the price of admission. The silence afterward was my victory. I went into my office, closed the door, and sat at my desk. My heart was pounding, but it was with anticipation, not fear. I listened. The first person to arrive was Jen from marketing. I heard her footsteps pause outside my door. A long silence. Then her footsteps continued quicker. Now next was David. I heard him stop. I imagined him adjusting his glasses, leaning in to read it. He let out a low whistle, barely audible, and then moved on. By 9 a.m., the office was humming with its usual energy, but there was a new undercurrent, a hushed tension. I heard the murmurs. I saw people walking past my door, then slowing down their heads, turning. Some would read it and glance quickly towards Mark's office or Chloe's desk. The news traveled without a single word being spoken directly to me. Then I saw them. Mark and Chloe arrived together, laughing about something, their voices echoing down the hall. They reached the cluster of desks outside my office. Their laughter died mid-sentence. They saw the small crowd, the glances. Chloe's eyes flicked to my door. Her face, usually a mask of cool confidence, went slack with surprise. Then it tightened into a frown. She read the sign. I watched her shoulders stiffen. Mark stepped closer, his back to me. I saw his neck turn red. He read it once, then twice. He didn't say a word. He just turned and walked straight to his office, shutting the door with a sharp click. Chloe stood there for a moment, utterly exposed. She looked around as if hoping to share a joking eye-roll with someone. But everyone suddenly found something very interesting on their computer screens. The silence around her was deafening. She smoothed her blouse, a nervous, futile gesture, and hurried away. I pushed on, my voice tightening. I explained the data, the rationale, the potential ROI. I was nearing the conclusion, feeling a small flicker of hope that I'd managed to get through it. When Mark cleared his throat, he didn't wait for me to finish. About an hour later, I got an email from Sarah, my manager, and Ben from HR. They asked to see me. I walked into the conference room, my back straight. They were both there, their expressions serious but not angry. Ben spoke first. We saw the sign on your door. We've also had a few informal conversations this morning about the team meeting yesterday. He paused. We want to apologize. What you experienced was a clear violation of our conduct policy. It should never have happened. Putting that policy on your door was a brave way to reclaim your space. We'll be scheduling mandatory training for the entire department, starting with a session on giving and receiving constructive feedback. Sarah nodded. I should have intervened yesterday. I am sorry. I didn't. Your project has merit, and we'd like to review it properly in a respectful setting next week. 2 days later, Mark appeared at my door. He didn't come in. He stood in the hallway, his hands in his pockets, looking at the floor. Look. He mumbled about the meeting. It got a bit heated. Sorry. If things were said that came off the wrong way, it wasn't a good apology. It was strained and cowardly, an attempt to frame it as a misunderstanding. But it was an admission. I simply nodded. Thank you, Mark, I said, my voice calm. He nodded quickly and retreated. The dynamic in the office shifted. The clique's power, which had been built on everyone's fear of being their next target, evaporated overnight. They were now the ones who had been publicly, albeit silently, called out. People started coming to me more often. They asked for my opinion on projects. They included me in conversations. It wasn't out of pity, it was out of a newfound respect. They saw that I hadn't screamed or quit. I had used the system. I had been smarter. The sign stayed on my door. It became a quiet legend in the office, a reminder that the loudest person in the room isn't always the strongest. Sometimes strength is a quiet decision, a meticulously chosen words placed where everyone can see them. The humiliation in that conference room didn't break me. It was the fire that forged a colder, sharper, and more confident version of myself. I learned that the most satisfying victory isn't about yelling louder than your opponents. It's about speaking so clearly and truthfully that their laughter suddenly has nowhere to hide and dies in their throats. I was juggling it all, or at least I was trying to. My dad had just started his 3rd round of chemotherapy. The drives to the hospital were getting longer. The nights were getting more broken with phone calls and worry and work. Well, work had to go on. The deadlines didn't care about my personal life. The project milestones were unmoving dates on a calendar, completely indifferent to the fact that my own father was fighting for his life. The office was the kind of place that seemed supportive on the surface. We had the modern furniture, the free snacks, the quarterly team-building events. But there was an unspoken rule, a current, that ran just under the placid surface. You kept your personal life personal, you were professional, which meant you were calm, collected, and productive. Your problems were something you handled on your own time. There was a shared fiction. We all participated in that. Outside of these glass walls, our lives were as orderly and predictable as our project plans. 15%, he said, his tone dripping with mock curiosity. That's a pretty specific number from a dataset that, let's be honest, is mostly speculative. It feels a little ambitious, or maybe just naive. A few people shifted uncomfortably. Chloe chuckled softly, not looking up from her screen. It was a Tuesday morning. I'd come straight from the hospital, my eyes gritty from lack of sleep, my coffee doing absolutely nothing to cut through the fog of anxiety. Sarah, my manager, popped her head over my cubicle wall. She's a good person, genuinely. She was just checking in the way managers do. So everything on track for the client presentation on Friday? She asked, smiling. You seem a little distracted this week. Everything okay? It was the everything okay that did it. It was such a simple, well-intentioned question. But it was the key that unlocked a vault of emotion I had been desperately trying to keep sealed. I opened my mouth to give the standard automatic reply, yeah, all good, just a late night. But the words wouldn't come out. Instead, my throat closed up, my vision blurred. And before I could stop it, before I could even turn away, a single hot tear rolled down my cheek, then another. The silence was the worst part. Sarah's smile just froze on her face. A couple of my other coworkers, Mark and Jenny, who were walking by, stopped in their tracks. I saw the shock on their faces. And then from Mark, a low, nervous chuckle. Jenny elbowed him. But she was fighting a smile too. It wasn't malicious, not really. It was just the sheer uncomfortable strangeness of it. People don't cry at their desks. It was a breach of the unspoken code. And their laughter was a reflex, a way to try and normalize something that felt profoundly abnormal. I mumbled an apology, grabbed my bag, and practically ran for the bathroom, leaving a cloud of profound awkwardness behind me. I locked myself in a stall and slid down to the floor. The shame was immediate and all-consuming. Weak. I felt so weak. I had worked so hard to build a reputation as someone who was reliable, who could handle pressure. And in one unguarded moment, I had shattered it. All I could think about was their faces, the pity in Sarah's eyes, the awkward laughter from Mark. I drafted a text to Sarah in my head, telling her I wasn't feeling well, that I was going to work from home for the rest of the week. Hiding felt like the only option, to retreat, to lick my wounds in private, and to hope that by Monday everyone would have forgot. But as I sat there on the cold tile floor, a different thought began to form. Hiding was exhausting. Carrying this weight alone, while also pretending it wasn't. There was what had led to this breaking point in the first place. What if hiding was the real weakness? What if the brave thing, the strong thing, wasn't to conceal the struggle, but to name it? I didn't want a confrontation. I didn't want to have a tearful meeting where I had to explain myself. The thought made me feel ill. But I needed them to understand that my tears weren't about a stressful project or a missed deadline. They were about something real, so I decided to do it in the only way I felt I could control. I went back to my desk, avoided everyone's eyes, and found a simple piece of printer paper. I opened a text document, and I started to write. It wasn't long, it wasn't an accusation, it was just a quiet statement of fact. My mouth went dry. The data is compiled from 3 separate industry reports. I started to explain, but Mark just waved a hand. I wrote, "Thank you for your concern. I am navigating some challenging personal times as my father undergoes cancer treatment. I appreciate your patience and understanding." I printed it, and with a deep breath I taped it to the outside of my office door. It felt like the biggest risk I had ever taken. I was putting my vulnerability on display, making my private pain public. I was terrified that it would backfire, that it would be seen as unprofessional, as a plea for sympathy. I was exposing the very thing had been taught to hide. The first hour was agonizing. I heard people stop outside my door. I saw shadows through the frosted glass. There was a lot of silence. Then I got an email from Sarah. It wasn't a reprimand. It said, "I had no idea. Thank you for sharing that with us. Please take whatever time you need. We're here for you." A little while later, a cup of tea appeared on my desk, left there silently by Jenny. Mark, the one who had laughed, didn't come by, but I saw him through the window, standing at my door, reading the note for a long time. His expression wasn't mocking anymore. It was thoughtful, almost pained. He looked like he was carrying a new heavy weight. Later that afternoon, he knocked softly and came in. He didn't make eye contact at first, just shifted his weight from foot to foot. "Listen," he said, his voice low. "About earlier, I am really sorry. That was a jerk move. My mom had a health scare last year, and it just messes with your head." I shouldn't have laughed. His apology was clumsy, but it was real. The shame had shifted. It was no longer mine to carry alone. That small note on my door acted like a magnet for empathy. Over the next few days, the responses were quiet, but profound. Colleagues I'd only ever exchanged polite greetings with would stop by and simply say, "How's your dad today?" or "My thoughts are with your family." I received emails from people on other floors, people I barely knew, sharing stories of their own parents' illnesses, their own struggles to balance work and caregiving. They weren't offering solutions. They were offering solidarity. They were saying, "I see you, and you're not alone." The office environment began to change. The silence around personal struggle was broken. The door, which I had feared would be a mark of my weakness, became something else entirely. It wasn't a shield I was hiding behind. It was an invitation for genuine human connection. The following week, Sarah called a team meeting. It wasn't about project updates. She started by thanking me for my courage. She said my honesty had started an important conversation that we needed to have as a team. She talked about how we all bring our whole selves to work, and that sometimes those selves are going through difficult things. She asked everyone to share what support would look like for them, not just in a crisis, but in the day-to-day management of life. People spoke up. They talked about flexible hours, about the pressure to always seem on, about the need for a culture where it's okay to not be okay. Sitting in that meeting, I realized something fundamental. The energy I had been expending to appear invulnerable, to maintain that facade of having it all together, was far greater than the energy it took to simply be authentic. Hiding my pain had been a full-time job on top of my actual job. Sharing it, as terrifying as it was, had liberated me. It allowed my colleagues to see me as a whole person, and in doing so it gave them permission to be whole people too. "Industry reports," he repeated, turning to Chloe. "Remember that intern last year who based his whole proposal on industry reports? What was that hilarious conclusion?" He came to Chloe, finally looked up, her eyes bright with malice. The change didn't end with that one conversation. The incident sparked a real shift. HR, prompted by Sarah, initiated a review of our policies around bereavement and family care leave. More importantly, a group of us started an informal weekly check-in, a voluntary meeting, where people could talk about the challenges they were facing both inside and outside the office. It became a space of psychological safety, a direct result of one moment of public vulnerability. What I learned is that we often mistake invulnerability for strength. We think that building walls and hiding our scars makes us powerful. But that's an illusion. True strength, the kind that builds resilient teams and genuine connections, is the courage to be vulnerable. It's the strength to say this is hard for me right now. And to trust that the people around you will respond with compassion. My moment of greatest perceived weakness. The tears I was so ashamed of turned out to be the very thing that made our workplace stronger, kinder, and more human. It taught all of us that it's okay to be a work in progress, to be messy, to be human. And that is a power that no amount of pretended perfection can ever match. The air in the office was always thick with it, not just the smell of stale coffee and toner, but this heavy, tired feeling. We were chronically understaffed. You'd look around and see empty desks that used to be full, but the workload never shrank. It just got redistributed, piled onto the rest of us, until our own desks were practically groaning. And the deadlines, they weren't just unrealistic, they were a joke. A cruel one. Management would set these arbitrary finish lines completely detached from the actual hours in a day, and then act surprised when we couldn't perform miracles. And the management team, dismissive, doesn't even cover it. It was like talking to a brick wall that occasionally sent back emails asking for status updates. You'd explain carefully why a project timeline was impossible, and you'd get a pat response about lean principles and maximizing efficiency. They didn't see people, they saw resources, expendable ones. I'd been involved quietly in trying to change things for months. I'd been having hushed conversations by the water cooler, testing the waters, talking about a union. But the response was always the same: apathy, fear, a lot of shrugged shoulders, and muttered excuses. It's just the way things are. We're lucky to have jobs. They'll just fire us if we make noise. It was this ingrained helplessness, this belief that we had no power. It was the most frustrating part. The problem wasn't just the conditions, it was the conviction that we had to accept them. Then came the announcement. It was a Thursday afternoon. The department head, a man named Carl, who never looked anyone in the eye, called an all-hands meeting. He stood up there smiling, this empty corporate smile, and told us that to meet a new client demand, mandatory overtime was being implemented, effective immediately. And then he dropped the real bomb. It would be unpaid. Consider it a demonstration of your commitment to the team, he said. A shared sacrifice. A shared sacrifice. The words hung in the air. I looked around the room. I saw faces fall. I saw jaws tighten. But no one said a word. There was just this resigned silence, this awful heavy acceptance, and something in me just broke. It wasn't a slow burn, it was a snap. Oh God, yes, she said, a wide smile spreading across her face. He said we should invest in fax machine marketing, because the reports showed a resurgence in retro tech. The two of them laughed, a sharp, ugly sound. A couple of others at the table joined in a nervous, obligatory laughter. I stood up. My chair scraped back loudly in the quiet room. My voice came out shaky, but loud. A shared sacrifice. Carl, we're already working 50, 60-hour weeks. People are skipping meals. People are missing their kids' birthdays. What exactly are you sacrificing? He blinked, his smile frozen. Now, let's not be emotional. That's when it all poured out. Weeks, months, years of frustration, the exhaustion, the fury. It all boiled over. Emotional. You're asking us to donate our time, our lives for free. How else are we supposed to be grateful? My voice cracked. I could feel the heat in my face, the prickle in my eyes. I was so tired, so profoundly tired. The tears weren't a choice. They were a collapse. They just started streaming down my face, hot and embarrassing. I was crying right there in front of everyone, my voice trembling with a mix of rage and utter defeat. And that's when I heard it, a few nervous, uncomfortable laughs from my coworkers, people I sat next to every day. It wasn't malicious, not really. It was the sound of sheer discomfort, of fear. They didn't know how to handle the outburst. It was easier to treat it as a spectacle, a momentary break from the oppressive normal, than to acknowledge the truth it represented. But in that moment, hearing that nervous laughter, while I stood there exposed and raw, it felt like the deepest kind of humiliation. I walked out of the meeting room. The silence behind me was worse than the laughter. I went straight to the restroom, locked myself in a stall, and tried to pull myself together. My hands were shaking. The humiliation was a physical ache. I had made a fool of myself. I had shown weakness. And they had laughed. That was the story, right? The emotional one who cracked under pressure. But as I stood there splashing cold water on my face, a different thought started to cut through the shame. That laughter, it wasn't about me. Not really. It was a symptom. It was the sound of a group of people who had been so beaten down, so conditioned, To accept injustice, that any deviation from the script even, a cry of pain was terrifying their laughter, was a defense mechanism. It was a way to distance themselves from my outburst, to reassure themselves that they weren't that far gone that they could still hold it together. And that's when the pivot happened, the strategy clicked into place. They had seen me break, they had seen the emotion. What if I gave them something else to see, something they couldn't laugh away? Something cold, hard, and undeniable. I went back to my desk. I ignored the sideways glances, I opened a blank document, and I started to type. This wasn't going to be a personal plea. This was going to be a public bulletin. I felt a hot flush spread from my chest up my neck. This is different, I said, but my voice was smaller now, it was cracking. I printed everything out. I walked over to my office door, a cheap hollow thing like everything else in the building. I took a roll of tape, and I started posting not a sad note about my feelings data. First, I put up a wage comparison, our average salaries for our positions, next to the industry standard for the city. The disparity was staggering, a 20 sometimes 30% gap. I highlighted it in bright yellow. Next, I printed out excerpts from the state labor law, the sections about mandatory overtime and compensation. I underlined the relevant parts that made Carl's shared sacrifice announcement not just insulting, but likely illegal. Then I added quotes, direct verbatim quotes from management emails, and from the meeting itself. We need to do more with less. Perception of commitment is key. Unpaid overtime. I let their own words hang there, stripped of their corporate polish, exposed for what they were. And at the bottom, in clear bold letters, I wrote a call to action, not a vague complaint, a direct invitation. It listed the time: after work, 6 p.m., a Placia-neutral location, a conference room at the public library downtown. And it stated plainly the purpose: a meeting to discuss our legal rights and the process of collective bargaining. It was a gamble, a huge one. I was using the public nature of my humiliation as a stage. I was making the private struggle undeniably, unavoidably public. They could laugh at tears. But could they laugh at a legal statute? They could dismiss emotion. But could they dismiss a percentage point on a spreadsheet? The rest of the day was quiet, but a different kind of quiet, not the quiet of fear, but of absorption. I saw people slow down as they walked past my door, not making eye contact with me, but reading, really reading. I saw one woman stop, her hand flying to her mouth as she saw the wage comparison. I saw another guy, a real skeptic, pull out his phone and take a picture of the labor law section. The nervous laughter from the meeting was gone, replaced by these whispers in the break room, whispers. By the printer I heard my name, but it wasn't accompanied by a smirk. It was followed by words like, "Is this true?" And I had no idea it was that bad. Management's panic was swift. By mid-afternoon, Carl's assistant came by. She looked flustered. "You need to take that down," she said, her voice low. "It's creating a disruption." I looked at her. I felt surprisingly calm. "It's on my personal workspace," I said. "It's all factual information. Is there a policy against posting factual information?" "It's always different," Mark said, his eyes finally landing on me. They weren't just dismissive, they were cruel. That's the thing with these big ideas from quiet corners. They're always built on a house of cards. A lot of flashy slides, not a lot of substance. It's just not very professional. She didn't have an answer. She left. An hour later, Carl himself marched over. He tried to sound authoritative, but I could hear the strain. "This is inappropriate. This is not the forum for this discussion." I didn't back down. "What is the appropriate forum, Carl?" Because the meeting room this morning didn't seem to work. As we were talking, something amazing happened. Another coworker, Sarah, from accounting, a woman who never said boo to anyone, walked over. She didn't say anything to Carl. She just looked at the door, looked at me, and then taped up a small sticky note right next to my call to action. It just said, "Thank you." It was a small gesture, but it was everything. Carl saw it. His face fell. He realized he wasn't just dealing with one disgruntled employee anymore. He was facing a shift. He walked away without another word. That office door became a symbol. Over the next day, more notes appeared, messages of support, questions. A few people even added their own printouts comparing health insurance costs, noting unsafe working conditions. In the warehouse, it was no longer my door. It was our bulletin board, a focal point of a defiance that had been simmering under the surface for years. The meeting at the library that night was packed. People I'd never even spoken to about organizing showed up, And when I asked what brought them, a few of them said the same thing: I saw your door. The tears had been the spark. But the information on that door was the fuel. It gave people a language for their anger, a framework for their frustration that was more powerful than just emotion. The momentum was unstoppable. After that, we organized, we held votes. It wasn't always easy, and management fought back with everything they hated: empty promises, intimidation, tactics, but the fear was gone. It had been replaced by a solid, unshakable sense of solidarity. We won not just a union contract, but real concessions: fair wage increases, clear limits on overtime with proper compensation, a grievance procedure that actually had teeth. Looking back, I've thought a lot about that moment in the meeting room. The tears were real, the exhaustion was real, the humiliation was real. But the response, that was a choice, a tactical one. We transformed a moment of perceived weakness into our movement's greatest strength. We showed that vulnerability isn't the opposite of power. Sometimes it's the pathway to it. When one person breaks the silence, it gives others permission to acknowledge their own breaking points. And that's where collective power is born, not in stoic silence, but in the honest, messy recognition of a shared pain, and the decision to face it together. The quarterly report was a disaster. The numbers were bad, worse than bad. And the email from upstairs was, well, you can imagine. It wasn't just a reprimand. It was a threat. They wanted a 20% increase in productivity by the next quarter. With the same budget, with the same staffing, it was an impossible demand. And the weight of it was a physical thing, a constant tight knot in my chest.